Welcome. If you'd like to state your name and the capacity in which you're appearing today, that would be great.
Thank you. Dr. Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, and thanks for having us today.
Hi there, I'm Polly Hemming. I'm currently the Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute.
Thank you very much for coming along today. We will go to Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to start, we've just been hearing a lot about the CBAM and particularly what's happening over in the EU. What's the Australia Institute's position on the introduction of CBAM?
Well, obviously, it's fascinating to hear so much talk about something that doesn't exist, hasn't been designed, isn't proposed. Professor Hugh Sadler and Frank Muller, actually, I think, for the Australia Institute 20 years ago were the first to propose the CBAM. So, in principle, it's a very good idea. I can't see what it's kind of got to do with the current conversation we're having. So I guess we'll submit our written submission rather than present it. But a key point that we're making is that we're being asked to consider a bill that links to a whole bunch of things that haven't been invented yet.
Yeah.
And we're being
like
told,
the technology in some instances.
like the technology, like the governance, like the existence of other pieces of legislation. And on the one hand, we're being told that we have to rush this bill through, but at the same time we're saying, and there's going to be some great stuff coming up that'll interact with, brackets, hopefully well.
Yeah, no, I think it's the lack of transparency that's probably creating this reaching out to things that don't really exist yet. But anyway, if I could just come to, your support as an organisation for the creation of the $275 penalty for per tonne for organisations, is that something that you support?
I actually think that that's too high. And in previous submissions, we've suggested that a much simpler way to achieve a lot of the intention of this legislation would be to give entities access to a voluntary fixed price penalty payment at around the likely cap price. So rather than have a complicated price cap, which you may have heard described as a price cap, but people involved in this in other forums concede that it might not actually operate as a price cap, which is a concern to manufacturers.
You've got a market mechanism there, so
yeah, it's
all a bit unclear, isn't it?
Look, it's very unclear. As an economist, I know what a price cap is. It means the price won't go above a number. I haven't heard the government commit that that's what this price cap will operate as. But regardless, I think a very simple solution to the complexity and uncertainty of the price cap would simply be to give firms the option to make a payment of a number like the price cap, a payment to the government. It would prevent the government being exposed to the risk that the price cap goes up. And if that were in place, there would be no need for a $275 penalty payment.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. I don't understand the function of a penalty payment when you've got a price cap.
I don't think you're the Lone Ranger there.
I was just going to add something. I was listening to Senator Canavan before saying, what's the impact to small businesses here? Potentially an alternative, voluntary penalty payment could go into something like Powering the Regions or some other fund, and then that would actually aid the decarbonisation of those smaller businesses that aren't necessarily covered by the safeguard. It's very limited in the number of facilities and the industries, but there's not necessarily smaller businesses getting the assistance that they need through the safeguard or other means. And
I think also, Senator Canavan's talking about the impacts of businesses closing down or reducing in size, that then has the flow on, particularly in the regions.
So if they get the assistance where they can implement technology that means they don't have to, then that's probably a win for the community and those businesses.
Yeah, so I just want to have a quick discussion, if we can, around the industries that are going to find it particularly difficult with regards to abatement, so cement, steel, aluminium, those sort of industries. Where does the Australia Institute sit with regards to these industries that are going to find it unable to reduce emissions? Because, as we said, the technology doesn't exist yet. Should they be industries that Australia maintains or look to exit and allow to close? What's the position there?
Look, I'm very concerned that one of the consequences of the design of this proposal is that we'll place unnecessary amounts of pressure on industries that find it almost impossible to reduce their emissions, while placing no pressure on industries that would find it easy. It's interesting, like the only reason that we're talking about 100,000 tonnes, the only reason we're talking about 215 facilities is because an arbitrary decision was made 5 years ago. Different industries face quite different challenges for reducing their emission abatement, for achieving emission abatement, and I think good policy would either treat all industries across the country evenly, so an economy-wide carbon price is what economists tend to like, or if we don't want to have an economy-wide approach, we should have a sectoral approach. But facilities that happen to produce more than 100,000 tonnes are not a sector. It's a coincidence. So you could have a facility that emits 90,000 tonnes not covered, compared to that releases 101,000 tonnes covered. Like, it's not a sector. It's just a kind of
A random number.
a random number. So I think that the design of the current scheme places enormous pressure on very hard to abate parts of the economy, like cement. I think it's an extreme example. To a lesser extent steel, but steel in the short term, while doing nothing to encourage easy to abate sectors like renewable energy and electricity, or doing nothing to discourage new coal and gas opening up. So I think that the reality is this bill treats manufacturing and the fossil fuel industry as if they're in the same sector. Well, no one in manufacturing is making $7 billion this year, and it's a lot easier to avoid opening up a gassy new coal mine than it is to help a cement kiln significantly reduce its emissions.
So when you talk about easy to abate industries that could potentially make cuts, I mean, electricity is not included. So when we look at the big four banks, for example, and the volume of electricity used by them as organisations, branches, central offices, all those sorts of things, yet there's no consideration of the electricity used by them. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about, that looking at inclusion there to encourage those sort of industry or those sort of organisations that could reduce it through use of renewable energy, for example?
Absolutely. So, for example, again, to stick with the theme, there's a random number that's generated a random number of facilities. The safeguard mechanism places no obligation on anyone really in the transport sector to reduce emissions, no obligation to reduce emissions in the electricity sector, no obligations in the household sector. These are the easy to abate parts of the economy. So we've invented a climate policy that's kind of aimed at the most energy intensive, hardest to abate parts of the economy with no actual policy for the rest of the economy. And to be clear, it would be a lot cheaper for commercial buildings in Sydney and Melbourne to reduce their energy use, a lot cheaper than it would be for a cement kiln. But because they're not covered in the safeguard mechanism, that opportunity to say, why aren't we doing it here instead of here, that opportunity has been ignored. We're sort of obsessed with carbon credits coming out of the land sector, and we're paying no attention to really low cost abatement in energy efficiency, in electricity, in transport. It's not economics, it's just this random number from years ago that's
ideology.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just my final question. I noticed in your submission you made some emphasis around new entrants not being able to take up carbon credits, and certainly around new coal and gas. I'm just interested whether or not you've put any thought to the lithium business in the emerging sector there, and whether or not Australia's lithium processing sector would be made, we wouldn't be competitive on the international stage if they weren't able to access this sort of carbon credit.
Sure. Polly, did you want to?
Yeah, it probably goes on from your previous question where the safeguard fundamentally sort of lumps everyone in together, whereas you've got sort of mining and extractive industries, and then you've got manufacturing and sort of critical minerals like that. And I think there's a lack of understanding around how unfair it is to those manufacturing and critical minerals industries that you can have kind of unfettered expansion of gas and coal. So I think we are going to see manufacturing and minerals emissions and production increase in Australia. The issue is that they are potentially going to be prohibitive from expanding, because for every new, gas or coal mine that enters the scheme or emits more than it should, that places the burden on all those other industries. So we're talking very specifically about gas and coal facilities that are predominantly for export, so that you don't get the benefits in Australia, where we weren't talking about new facilities where we will be needing sort of those critical minerals and manufacturing for the Australian economy. So does that adequately answer?
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, to be clear, the world's going to need more lithium to transition to a net zero economy. The world's not going to need more coal and gas to achieve that. So I think...
I think that's debatable.
Well, the IEA, the UNFCCC, but let's focus on what we agree on. We are going to need to extract more rare earths, and I think we should refine them and manufacture them here in Australia. I find it bizarre that we would be potentially curtailing the ability to grow the industries that we know are going to grow in order to make room in the short term for industries that most people accept are going to decline. So again, this idea, I think one of the biggest problems with this legislation is that its starting point is that we can do something interesting and important if only we focus on 215 facilities. This has got nothing to do with economics, it's got nothing to do with science, it's just a number that was selected for another purpose years ago, now dominating the design of industry and economic policy in Australia today.
I just find it endlessly entertaining. Coal and mine gassing, coal and gas mining bad. Lithium, rare earth mining, that's all good. It's very interesting that one type of mining's terrible, the other type of is what we need for the renewable sector, and it's all good.
I don't think mining is good or bad. I think the activities that come with mining is good or bad. And what the climate scientists tell us is that when we mine coal and gas, we get a huge amount of fugitive methane, and then we generate enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. If the climate scientists told me that lithium had similar problems, I would have the same concerns, but they haven't.
Yeah, but we need it for the batteries, so...
Yeah, but it's not, I don't have a problem with mining. I drove here today in a car made of steel.
I'm glad you recognise the consistency of view there. I'm not quite sure everybody else does.
My view is entirely consistent, I promise you.
The broad hypocrisy is endlessly entertaining, but I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hughes. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. Ms Hemming, you've done a lot in relation to looking at the integrity of offsets, and offsets are a big part of what this safeguard mechanism crediting scheme will need to use. What is the biggest problem you see here in terms of if we don't have amendments to the way ACCUs are currently used, or the creation of these new SMCs, is it a false economy in terms of the amount of carbon being produced, the amount of carbon being offset?
Yeah, I think so. I guess you would look at sort of what the projected use of offsets is going to be under the safeguard, and over 50% is due to gas and coal facilities or mines, and they have very limited means to reduce or their absolute emissions or decarbonise. So they're going to be leaning very heavily on offsets, and putting aside the issue of whether offsets have integrity for a minute, whether they're actually reducing or avoiding emissions, the government has put a price cap on those, so they're keeping they're suppressing the price of offsets, which means that it's probably a more appealing option for anyone, regardless if you're gas and coal. And if a whole lot of offsets are being bought up from the land sector, then no decarbonisation is actually happening. As you said, we're sort of shuffling around, it's accounting, we're shuffling around emissions reductions from one sector to another. Of course, we need to help farmers store more carbon in their soil. Of course, we need to be protecting biodiversity. But fundamentally, if the aim of this scheme is transformational decarbonisation across the economy, buying offsets from the land sector is not it. And my concern is that there has been so much emphasis in the last few years that has kept the supply of land-based offsets up, which obviously keeps the price low, and the government's guaranteeing that that price will stay low, then we're just treading water.
It's clear that the government won't entertain zero offsets. I mean, we've heard why it's important to have access to some offsets, because there are genuine sectors that are it's very difficult to abate, and sectors that are going to need time for that genuine decarbonisation to occur. So what are the biggest priorities in terms of reforming the current system to ensure that we're not just shuffling numbers from one page of the government document to the next?
I think a limit is actually going to drive more decarbonisation, like a quantitative limit or even a qualitative limit would actually drive more decarbonisation, because it just makes offsets less available, and that's going to lead to probably the price increasing, probably scarcity if we improve the integrity, and then that would leave the people that really wanted to buy offsets as sort of where the majority of demand was coming from. I don't understand the mentality behind unfettered offsets, because ultimately the government is not going to be able to meet its 43% reduction target if it just continues to allow that supply to infinitely increase.
Can I just say, there's a pea and thimble trick being played here, and that is that I absolutely accept that in the long run there will be some sectors that are hard to decarbonise and hard to abate, and we absolutely need to think about how we can get to net zero because of that. The pea and thimble trick is to say, so let's avoid actually doing simple stuff today, because in 2050 some stuff will be hard. And we've been putting off the hard stuff my whole adult life. And greenhouse gas emissions in Australia from the fossil fuel sector have been growing my whole adult life. But we've always been told, let's not rush, let's not rush, let's not rush, let's not rush. Now we're being told, let's not do simple decarbonisation today. Let's not start with the decarbonisation today, because don't you know it's going to be hard for cement in 2050? Well, I do know it's going to be hard for cement in 2050. That's why we need to do all the simple stuff now. So I think we have to be very careful about this idea that offsets are just there for the hard to decarbonise bits. Great. So can we just all be quiet about that and focus on the decarbonised bits? And the more we actually drive actual decarbonisation in this term of government in the next 5 years, the less we'll need offsets in the future. But we're having this whole conversation around offsets rather than about what can we do, for two reasons. One, because offsets are the only way the fossil fuel industry can expand, and that's what's driving this whole debate. Offsets are the only way the fossil fuel industry can continue to expand, and for firms that have played this game for 30 years, have avoided decarbonisation for 30 years, they can wind out another 3 to 5 years of, I'll get around to it soon, if they just buy a few more offsets and talk about a CBAM that hasn't been invented.
So, to that point, the government's already named 7 gas projects that they expect to start, these are new projects, by 2030. Obviously, the safeguard mechanism isn't doing anything to help decarbonise those or avoid those from happening.
No, but it's helping get them approved. It's helping get the political capital to have them built. So, yeah, look, unfortunately, this is a cap and trade scheme that doesn't have a cap. And we're often told by the government, oh, but some people will be shutting down, and as luck would have it, the people shutting down will be about equal to the number of people showing up. There is no evidence put forward to support that.
Well, how can the government be serious about saying that they are committed to stopping the climate crisis then if what you're saying is true?
Well, I think the science is overwhelming. If you were serious about tackling climate change urgently, you would stop expanding the production of fossil fuels, and you would massively ramp up the rate of investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency. You would stop native forest logging, you would stop broadacre land clearing. None of this is hard. None of this is new. But yeah, I think what we're doing...
We're not waiting for new technology to do that.
We don't need any new technology to do all... And this is the point. If we were serious, and that's a big if, but if we're serious about reducing emissions in the short term, we know exactly what to do. We know exactly how to do it. What we don't know how to do is decarbonise cement. So I'm absolutely fine treating them separate. Right? The idea that we can't kind of get on with decarbonising the Australian electricity system, transport system, commercial building sector, that we can't get on and do that because cement, it's ridiculous, except if what you were doing was just buying another 3 or 5 years of inaction.
Would a rigorous climate trigger, backed by and enforced by an independent environment agency, be one way to put that pressure on those more polluting new entrants?
Look, I'm not an expert in the EPBC, but I guess I would say that we already know that Australia doesn't need to build new coal and gas to help Australia decarbonise. We already know that the world, if it's going to commit to 1.5 degrees, achieve its commitment to 1.5 degrees, isn't going to need more coal and gas. So I think it's common sense that if Australia's trying to reduce its emissions and the world's trying to reduce its emissions, we just won't need them. Whether that's best achieved by stating the obvious and saying we don't need to build any, or by on a case-by-case basis, every time being surprised to learn, hey, we don't need this, I really don't have a strong view. But what I do know is that the science is compelling, and it seems weird to me if we're trying to decarbonise the economy, we'd still be building projects that carbonise the economy.
Well,
but
seems weird to me. We have environment laws in this country that give a green tick of approval for a project when they haven't even considered the climate damage to the environment.
I think you've nailed the fundamental issue that any robust climate policy in Australia would actually get to the source of what is increasing emissions, and that is fossil fuel expansion domestically and globally. The safeguard mechanism is our key emissions reduction policy, yet perversely it doesn't tackle that. It actually allows fossil fuel expansion, and I think, as Richard pointed out, it provides the illusion of a regulatory burden on new fossil fuels. And again, Senator Hughes said, if we're not tackling, might be paraphrasing here, I think, but if we're not actually addressing the number one thing that is driving emissions to increase in Australia, then this is not a climate policy, and what is the point of it? It all feels very performative. We don't know how it's going to work, we don't know when it's going to work, we don't know what other policies are going with it. If we had some certainty on whether new fossil fuels were going ahead, new gas and coal for export was going ahead, we would be able to be providing much more certain and constructive answers about how the safeguard reform could work and how the below baseline credits could work, which is why we're here. We can't answer any of it, and all we can tell you is how bad it could get.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I mean, we talk about how cement's hard to abate. Once you build a gas well, it's hard to abate. Once you build a coal mine, it's hard to abate. So if we're still approving hard to abate things, isn't that going to make it harder in 2050 to abate?
Well, it's pouring fuel onto the fire, isn't it? Ms Hemming, I know other people have questions. I want to go to the issue around the actual integrity of a number of these credits. Obviously, the Chubb review was supposed to settle the controversy around whether the existing ACCUs represent actual abatement or not. I think it's fair to say that there's still a lingering sense of unease about where these ACCUs come from, particularly in relation to those land-based credits, as you've talked about. Can you tell us what's the number one thing that you'd like to see to make sure we have integrity in the credits that are actually being traded?
I think we need actually a legitimately independent thorough audit of every carbon credit method under what's called the Emissions Reduction Fund currently. I think you're right. There's still huge question marks over the three biggest methods that were investigated. It seems like an incredible risk that the government is willing to take to allow them under the safeguard, because what if they got it wrong? What if Professor Chubb got it wrong? You know, we're really willing to take that risk. But more concerningly is that even though there's over 100 million of those credits of questionable integrity that could be available to safeguard facilities, we've also got over 400 new soil credit projects being registered. They haven't started having credits issued to them, but the veracity of soil carbon as an abatement method is, I can't even think of the right word, it is so dodgy. You cannot use soil to legitimately abate CO2 or carbon, or it's incredibly easy to game. So to answer your question directly, there should be a full independent scientific audit of every carbon credit method, and if you wanted answers now in terms of getting this legislation or this rule through, the credits that were part of the Chubb review should not be allowed under the safeguard, just to have that buffer of security and not to create that risk that they are actually junk.
And what's the impact of overseas credits, and are they going to be allowed to be bought and used under this scheme?
So the government has suggested that will be something for review later in the year, but I note that they have already started drafting amendments to the legislation that would allow the import of international credits under the safeguard. The amount of lobbying from the gas and coal industry to allow international credits under the safeguard suggests, probably cynically, that they will be allowed, and we also have existing agreements with Fiji and Papua New Guinea that we will be trading carbon with them. It's a one-way bilateral scheme where those credits will be allowed into Australia to be used for compliance reasons. A majority of those carbon credits are from forest projects. Excuse me. You saw the Four Corners episode. You've seen other media reports that show that 90% of existing forest credits are junk. Without checking every project, I can't verify that, but it sounds about right. There is a huge risk that will eventuate, that credits will be allowed into Australia.
So at the very least, the government should just be really clear
I
and
would
rule out
say
international
very clear.
credits?
Yeah, and should rule out international credits. And I would also say, related to land-based credits generally, it's really important to remember that under the Kyoto Protocol, the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, and I won't get too technical, all land-based carbon credits were considered to be too high risk, too uncertain, and shouldn't be allowed to be used to offset industrial emissions. I'm not sure what happened in the last 30 years that suggested that, apart from branding, that suggested that now carbon credits from the land sector are a robust way to offset industrial emissions. So yes, sorry to answer your question, we should just be ruling out international credits.
And a simple, I think, amendment to this bill that would give the Senate a lot more confidence about ongoing integrity would be to create effectively a whitelist of what kind of ACCUs could be used in the safeguard mechanism, rather than just take for granted that because an ACCU has been created, it should be. So to be clear, there will always be measurement issues. The law required that all carbon credits generated to date were generated on the basis that the estimation was conservative. Right? There's supposed to be, if there's any error, we're supposed to be underestimating how much carbon. We've had a spectacular failure to enforce the law by the existing regulatory process. That's why the Chubb review needed to occur. So I think that an easy way to put a lot of discipline into the safeguard mechanism would be to say only credits generated by particular methods after a particular date can be used. And to be clear, while there will be measurement issues with safeguard mechanism credits, they will always be higher integrity than land-based credits. That's why Kyoto ruled out land-based credits. And as a consequence of that, I think it would be a real pity if we were actually incentivising the use of what are often very low integrity land-based credits rather than the safeguard mechanism credits. and I think Senator Pocock was alluding to this before. I think the idea that, for example, two ACCUs might be required to do the work of one safeguard mechanism credit or some form of exchange rate would make a lot of sense. To treat them on parity would be to assume their integrity is similar. There is no evidence to support that.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Your submission recommends delaying the safeguard mechanism reforms until the Chubb review recommendations have been fully addressed. I'm just interested in why you've put that in there and which of Professor Chubb's recommendations you consider most crucial for the success of these reforms.
Yeah, so, it's often suggested that, the Chubb review gave everything a clean bill of health. What it said was that the avoided deforestation method was so bad it should be ceased. But those projects that have already been approved are still, A, there are ACCUs generated last year from those projects, and B, the projects approved 3 years ago will be churning out ACCUs for years to come. So we haven't kind of got to the bottom of how many of those there are. Professor Chubb said that the human-induced regeneration method was fine, it just hadn't been implemented well. Well, that seems like a damning indictment on the people charged with implementing it well. And we've seen nothing about how that's going to be fixed. And the fact is rainfall, not human-induced, not changes in human behaviour, are dominating the amount of carbon that's being generated in those projects. So I think, and then of course the Chubb review recommended more transparency, yet there's been no increase in transparency. And I'm still being challenged to prove some assertions by people who know that the data required doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there's enormous problems yet to be addressed from the Chubb review.
Thank you. I'm interested in, earlier you mentioned having an optional payment as an alternative to the purchase and surrender of offsets. How would you see the price of that being set, and where should that revenue be directed?
I mean this with all respect. The price should be set arbitrarily by the democratic process. Just like 100,000 tonnes was arbitrarily selected, there's no right price for these things. And in fact, when I put my submission in, or when the Australian Institute put a submission in last year, I suggested $25 would be a nice enough price because that's the carbon price we had last time we went down this road, and people used to suggest anything higher was economy wrecking. Seems like I was a bit conservative and everyone's happy with $75. Well, okay, I'll take that. But to be clear, there's no economics behind picking a right number, and if it ends in a 0 or a 5, I promise you it had nothing to do with any data. It was just a convenient number. So I mean this in all sincerity, there is no right number here, but it's a lot higher than 0. I think it should be a lot lower than $275. And I think that providing a really simple optional payment for entities to allow them to put money into a fund where that fund can be used to help decarbonise industry, whether that's in the safeguard sector or elsewhere, would be enormously beneficial both for the entities and for the economy as a whole. This idea that all abatement has to take place either in the land sector or in the 215 entities is just beyond economics. Mm-hmm. We're ignoring all of the low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Earlier you also identified the tension between the use of the reserve and ACCUs by new entrants and extractive industries as against, say, the manufacturing sector. Within the safeguard framework, imagining that it does go ahead, how would you see that adequately addressed?
Well, I think the idea of a reserve in a climate policy seems odd. If we're trying to rapidly reduce emissions, why are we, except for the bit where we're going to let the emissions increase in the near future? I genuinely don't know why we're asking existing polluters to reduce their emissions by 5% a year while letting a brand new polluter set up next door. Like, I don't understand. So if we had some form of cap and trade scheme, we'd be setting a cap and then we'd be asking everybody to stay within it. The idea that if you had a cap and trade scheme, but then every year you started throwing new credits into the cap and trade scheme, you'd be laughed out of first year economics. But, you know, here we are. So, yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Like, in the confines of this weird structure we've built, what's the best way to do it? I think the best way to do it is to rule out new fossil fuel projects that have one and only one objective. And that is, well, two consequences, one objective. The consequence of building a new fossil fuel project is increased methane fugitive emissions, very large, and when the product's sold, for someone else to cause the climate change that's going to hurt Australian agriculture, that's going to hurt the Great Barrier Reef. So that's why I think new fossil fuel projects should be treated radically differently than new lithium refining plants, for example. Because the whole point of building a new fossil fuel project is to cause the problem that this legislation says it's trying to solve.
And just thinking through this approach where rather than a cap and trade system, we've got these 215 facilities, potential new entrants, and this ratcheting mechanism, but unlimited access to ACCUs. So I'm just interested how you see ACCUs being accounted for in our national accounts when it comes to obligations under Paris and the 1.5 degree target goal. How do we account for that when we go back to the UN?
Yeah, great question. I'll have a go at it and I'll defer to Polly as well. But the short answer is that few people realise that the accounting rules that we're using for ACCUs and the accounting rules we use for our national inventory report to our international partners are broadly unrelated. There's overlap between them, but there is nothing that any country in the world can do or would care to do about how we decide to generate carbon credits from soil, from mangroves, from promising not to chop down a tree. We as a nation state are free to waste as much time and as much money as we want, paying money to do things that don't actually sequester carbon. But when it comes to actually reporting, we, for example, rely on satellite imagery data, and if there's more trees, that's good. If there's less trees, that's bad. So yeah, we've kind of got this bizarre conversation taking place that, you know, we have to spend money on ACCUs because it will help us meet our international obligations. But to be crystal clear, if the ACCUs lack integrity, if the ACCUs aren't linked to activities or outcomes that are measured in the National Inventory Report, the ACCUs are just us wasting our time. It's like printing monopoly money. Polly, would you?
Yeah, I would just, I was just going to simplify it more. And the only time an ACCU, a carbon credit, represents something that shows up in the national inventory is if, say, a farmer is given a carbon credit for planting a tree and the tree grows, they get the carbon credit. Then the satellite data, satellite picks up that tree and then it's recorded in the inventory as, say, a tree that's worth 1 tonne. There's absolutely no crossover otherwise. So it's all pretend accounting. And there's a very good reason why Australia is keeping its domestic offset scheme domestic, because if we were to open the door to trading our carbon credits internationally, we would have to participate in a global accounting framework where every one of Australia's carbon credits that, you know, may or may not represent 1 tonne of CO2 is recorded as part of an official accounting framework. And so you just have to ask the question why it's not participating in that whole accounting framework. And it's because most of the offsets generated would not be reflected in it. Like we would effectively be selling, tallying monopoly money and then being busted for the fact that it was counterfeit.
So earlier we heard that the International Energy Agency's estimates of our methane emissions are 60% higher than the government's estimates. Has someone done the analysis of actual land sector abatement that we we could legitimately put onto our inventory and go to the UN and say we're doing this, versus the ACCU system that we have with the dozens of methodologies. Like, what's the discrepancy?
So we do that anyway, and that's why the ACCU system is so farcical, is because it's all happening anyway, but just not being recorded. Sorry, I'll just step back. We do all that anyway, and it's all picked up in our international accounting. The problem is that the techniques that we use to account for the amount of carbon our soils are storing, or the amount of trees that have grown, is pretty rough. There's some suggestions that this model, full cam it's called, is picking up too much green cover. We don't have long-term sort of historical references for how much carbon our soil stores, so a lot of it is very rough. We assume that, this is UNFCCC accounting, therefore we must be using the best methodologies, the best emissions factors and stuff. You've just said, they're clearly not picking up how much fugitive methane is being emitted. Potentially, we don't know whether our trees are actually storing the amount of carbon that they are, because it's really rough. It's just picking up green, basically, on satellite data. Australia's gotten very lucky with its accounting because we've had a lot of rain, and that's just meant that trees have grown, essentially, and that's all picked up in our national accounts. So we get to say, Australia's reduced its emissions by this much because those land sinks mask all the emissions from industry. If it turns out that actually, full cam is, the algorithm's not quite right, we're overestimating how much carbon is being stored in soil, that could look vastly different. It's all very rough, just because it's part of this official framework doesn't mean that it's actually really happening.
And also, to be clear, a lot of the methane estimates in Australia are just purely modelled. There aren't people out there measuring this stuff, it's modelled. And if you look at where the sort of fugitive emission factors come from, they're often actually international numbers from someone else's geology being used to have a guess at what it is in Australia. So I'm no expert in measuring fugitive emissions, but I do know that when you rely heavily on one data point, from one circumstance, it's a dangerous thing. So yeah, I fear that. Well, let's go back. If tackling climate change was as simple as paying someone to not chop down trees and paying someone to manage their soil differently, why didn't we think of this 30 years ago? How come every other country in the world is actually decarbonising their economies? If you strip out the impact of rain on Australian tree cover, you see that actually in Australia our fossil fuel emission use has been rising. It's falling in all the other developed countries. So here we are at a minute to midnight with a magic accounting solution. How come we didn't discover it earlier?
I was just going to also add, all our land-based accounting is modelled as well. No one is counting trees, and all carbon credits predominantly are modelled too. That's been the biggest issue. So whether it's soil carbon or human-induced regeneration, it's all down to a model, and you need to be pretty confident that model is correct to be able to assume that they can offset industrial emissions tonne for tonne.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I will just say that the Act amendments do not include international credits, and I would question some of the veracity of your absolutism on the fact that nothing works. But on that, I would ask, you proposed a carbon tax, like a $25 carbon tax, would be better than the safeguard mechanism. Do you feel that would incentivise facilities, captured facilities, to actually make change? You've got yours at 25. I mean, you did reference just before that was just, it's an arbitrary number. And the current number that we've got is 35 in terms of which one would encourage facilities better. do you see a carbon tax? I mean, obviously there's the theoretical notion of a carbon tax and there's the reality. We've been through the reality previously, which didn't go well. But do you feel that the carbon tax would be better and we just don't do the other things?
Like nearly all economists in the world, I think a carbon tax would be an efficient way to solve this problem. We didn't actually propose a carbon tax, although I'd be very happy to have one. If the ACCU price was lower than the fixed price we've put forward, then it wouldn't be a carbon tax. It would be the safeguard mechanism offsetting scheme, hopefully with some actual integrity behind the offsets. As to which number would generate the most abatement, the higher the number, the more abatement. That would absolutely be crystal clear. It wouldn't be linear, though, and the way that firms abated wouldn't be linear either. And as you've proposed it, as your government's proposed it, you've got a fixed a cap price that brackets may or may not be a cap at $75. That seems quite high to me. And a penalty price, which I don't understand at all, at $275, that seems quite high to me. I think it's interesting you think that the Gillard government's carbon price didn't work because what happened was the economy grew and emissions fell. So if you're asking me what number do I think would be the right number for a simple carbon tax, look, I'd take any number. And I think if it grew gradually over time, you'd give people certainty. And if back in literally 1998, I think I first suggested a $1 a tonne carbon tax that went up by $1 a year. Because I actually think the first dollar would drive most of the abatement because investors would look forward and think, yeah, it's only going to get dearer. But yeah, so we didn't actually recommend a carbon tax, but, be very happy to see one, as would nearly all the economists in the world. But I think if we're going to have something like a safeguard mechanism, then it seems very odd to treat the cement industry and the expansions of oil and gas and the manufacturing sector as if they're all the same.
But would a carbon tax or a fixed price not do exactly that? But also it would, the money would then go, as a tax, would go into the government, and then you would be assuming the government would then make decisions about what was going to be done to change behaviour, or because this isn't just straight out, let's stop doing X. This is an entire behaviour change. This is an entire sort of industry and economy shift that we need to achieve to reach our targets.
Yeah, no, unfortunately it's not, because it only applies to an arbitrary number, 215 entities, and most of the low-cost abatement available happens outside of those entities, and most of the low-cost abatement doesn't happen in the land sector. I mean, once upon a time we thought carbon credits would be cheap. Now we're talking about $75 a tonne. So, no, we don't have an economy-wide anything under this scheme. That's the problem with it. In terms of giving firms an incentive to change their behaviour, my point is a simple one. It's at the moment with current technology, it's just impossible for some firms to change their behaviour. The reason economists prefer a carbon price to, and no other country in the world has really tried this, the sort of carbon credit approach, is that a carbon price does two things at the same time. One, it provides a price signal to change behaviour. Two, it collects revenue that can be used either to either compensate people or invest in good things. What we're proposing to do is shovel enormous amounts of money from the covered sectors onto the owners of land sector projects, who are going to see ACCU prices rise from $12 to $30 to $70. And that money, that enormous amount of money that we're going to use the power of the state to force the manufacturing industry to buy these offsets, when we give all that windfall profit to the people selling the offsets, they don't have to do anything to help Australia cope with climate change at all. So that's why economists like collecting revenue. But if you want to give an enormous windfall gain to people who happen to have a block of land that happen to have a tree clearing permit, that's okay, but it's an enormous opportunity cost.
I think you and I would disagree significantly on many of the characterisations, so I don't think it's worth kind of going there. But I do think that the Chubb review and the tightening up and the recommendations in there are going to make a difference. Like the integrity is really important. It's really important to the government. It's really important to everyone that if we're going to take this sort of pathway, that integrity is there and is solid.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because before the Chubb review, we were assured there was integrity.
Hence the review.
No, the Clean Energy Regulator, the Carbon Market Institute, the industry said there's no problem. And then the Chubb review said, big problem with avoided deforestation. Human-induced regeneration, that's not working the way we planned it. So I guess the assurances that there are integrity from people now sound very similar to the assurances that there were integrity from the people who were adamant there wasn't a problem. How much integrity is enough? I guess, again, like the carbon price, that's a democratic question for you.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things, as we would all know, is that this is a highly politicised scenario, which hasn't helped us at all in the last number of years. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you coming in and answering questions for us.